Hey guys, my name is VaulSC, hope that you are doing well. In this video, the main thing that I want to tell you is that Conquest, The Last Argument of Kings by Paramellum is an excellent game, which I'm really enjoying at the moment. I'm playing it a lot, and if you're on the fence about trying it out, I really do recommend you give it a go. If you come from, for example, Infinity or one of the other systems with TTS, we have a great community on TTS now with some amazing 3D miniatures to try out. But if you, are not going to be doing that, if you're in your local scene and you know some of your friends who are playing and you're interested and they have armies, maybe you could borrow an army and play a demo game. Really recommend it because it's a great game in terms of like the miniatures and the gameplay and the community and the game balance as well. And the main reason why I play it is because it's so well supported by game balance updates every few months, maybe not that frequently sometimes, but they are reasonably good quality updates. So this video is really me just saying that to you, that Conquest is just well worth playing. It's a really good game, and that's the reason why I'm making so many YouTube videos about it. You will notice that in this very long YouTube video, I'm going to spend the rest of the time criticizing the game and telling you guys what I think is wrong with it and what needs to be fixed about it, and just going through a lot of detail about game balance wish listing. And I'm doing that from a place of love, right? You will notice that previously on my channel, I covered games like Warhammer 40,000, War Machine and Hordes, and Infinity by Corvus Belli. And I don't make videos about those games anymore. And it's because I don't really care about them. I don't care about improving them. To me, at least personally, I don't think there's any hope for those other systems. I'm moved to Conquest now because it's a game that's supported well from a game balance design perspective, right? So this is why I'm sort of coming into Conquest and actually making balance videos like this, where I'm sort of talking about what I feel could be better about it, because I just want the game to be as good as it could possibly be. So I want that to be your takeaway from it as the audience. I'm trusting you guys not to go away from this saying, oh my gosh, VaulSC is just such a whiner, he just keeps complaining about everything, he's just unhappy with the game. That's just not the case. I really love playing Conquest, I love building lists for it, and obviously I make videos effectively marketing the game for Parabellum for free. That's just what I do, right? This video, I just want to talk about all of the little things that I think would improve the game, in a sober and rational way. And please, give me a comment if you have anything to say about it yourself, and we'll also chat on Discord. But yeah, if you like this kind of analysis, please consider liking the video and subscribing to me. That'd mean a lot to me. I've got a lot more content for Conquest always coming. So shall we get into it? I am going to talk about a few things, just overviewing the competitive standpoint of the game at the moment, and then going through each of the factions and talking about what small changes I'd like to see. I'm not going to go into every tiny little bits and pieces. It'll be too long a video otherwise. I'm just going to talk about the main things that I would really like to see improved, okay? So that is the disclaimer. That is the rant. So overall, the first thing I want to talk about in terms of the rule system is about duels and challenges, where you have your regiment, which is in base contact with an enemy regiment, and you have a character in your regiment, and they have a character in their regiment, and you draw your character card, which allows you to do a character action of, issuing a challenge and dueling your opponent. And when we come over to the rules here, let me just zoom in on it. Your opponent can accept or decline, but if they decline, the penalties for declining are kind of weak sauce, and this got updated recently. Previously it was just that the unit gets broken, which was not good enough, really. It wasn't good enough a penalty because it's so easy for your opponent to rally that unit for free, and the repercussions of being broken aren't all that bad. And what they changed it to most recently, you can see the red text means that it's a fix, right? This was the recent patch, where it means that the regiment that had the character declining the duel can't seize the zone, right? That doesn't always come up. You might be challenging your opponent when they're not even in contact with a zone. So that's a lot of the situations we encounter. Also, your unit might be seizing it regardless, and that enemy unit might just be touching the zone, might not have much to say about it. So only in very rare circumstances does this actually become a meaningful penalty. Then you've got, okay, they use the lowest resolve characteristic in the regiment. Well, in a lot of cases, the regiment's resolve might be similar to or identical to the character leading it, so that doesn't always have a huge impact. Cannot benefit from the inspired rule. Well, again, there are a lot of regiments that get inspired all of the time, and secondarily, they may not necessarily need inspired. They may have already attacked this turn. Reroll successful resolve tests of 1, that can be kind of punishing, but note that this thing of using the lowest resolve and rerolling successful resolve tests of 1 doesn't affect Old Dominion at all, and until they reach tier 3, they're not able to inspire anyway, and when they are tier 3, they're always inspired, so they'd actually override that, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong there. And in terms of declining another duel into the end of the round, well, typically you're only going to be in contact with that regiment with one regiment at a time, so you're not going to have another character to issue another duel. So even though we just saw 5 bullet points where it's like, oh, penalty after penalty after penalty, because all of them are so situational and because they're not very meaningful, in the many, many games we've played since this patch, we've been finding that declining a duel is just really a slap on the wrist with a wet bus ticket. It's not really that impactful. And the result is that people don't really bother to issue duels. If somebody duels your character, you simply make the determination of whether, it's going to be to your advantage. If it is going to be to your advantage, they wouldn't have issued the duel in the first place. And the game goes on. So we don't really see combat characters being very useful, and more importantly, all of the many, 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 many items and upgrades you can make for your characters which influence duels, make them do more damage in duels, or they are tougher against duels, or the bodyguards rule, which was, I think, a thing for a while for regiments protecting a character. None of that really is a meaningful part of the game, and we want the game to be rich and diverse and actually have a lot to it. So I think that Parabellum really need to fix this ASAP. If it was up to me, I would try and find like the sweet spot, the balance between being the penalties for declining a duel being too weak and too extreme the other side. Like if you just made it that your regiment gets destroyed if your character declines a duel, that's obviously too much of a penalty. You can't have something extreme like that. What about if the character that issues the duel, if their opponent declines, what if you were able to make a free clash action with just that character? That would mean that if you have a tooled up character like a noble lord with 8 attacks, or a Koninger or something like that, or a Exiliarch with a special sword that does more damage, then you get a little more of an impact against their regiment and you might kill a stand. And that can be effective. And in real situations, your opponent, if they are sort of on the fence between holding that position and not, they may think about potentially accepting the duel to avoid that situation, and there'll be some risk involved, and people actually have to use their brains. That makes the game a bit more enjoyable. So a penalty like that, where it's just universally across the board, can be useful, and it's not a matter of, for example, Old Dominion just ignoring a whole bunch of the penalties as one faction. I think that would be one way to go. Another idea I had was that if your character declines a duel, your regiment that he's part of can't benefit from any of his abilities whatsoever for like a full game round, like until your opponent draws their character card again. That would mean that if you have like a banner that gives your unit like more Aura of Death or something like that, or a special spell that's affecting a regiment, you can't do it. They can't use their resolve. They can't do anything like that. So that might be a way of penalizing it as well. I'll leave it up to Parabellum to sort this problem out, but this is something which I think can really improve the game if we address it. Let's move on. So supremacy abilities overall are the kind of thing that determine how many lists are viable, how many different kind of builds are viable in the game once you reach a competitive standpoint. And I'm sorry to say that after everybody's playtested this and played so many games and tournaments, the community as a whole is at a point where we know which characters in which factions have the best supremacy abilities. So if you play Old Dominion, the people who are experienced with that faction know that the Strategos has the best supremacy ability. And if you go over to Wadroon, you know that it's the Matriarch's Queen, or in some cases the Chief on Foot for the Shock. You're not going to go to the Predator, for example. You're not going to go to the Scion. If you play Nords, you know it's going to either be the Shaman or the Jarl. We'll get to Nords later in this video, but you're not really going to see a Volva Warlord or a Varga Lord Warlord at the moment in the competitive scene. And, with Dwergum, it's going to be the Tempered Sorcerer, sometimes the Tempered Steel Shaper. So what I think Parabellum really, really needs to do is to have a hard look at every character supremacy ability and find the ones that people aren't using in tournaments very often, if ever, and just give them a bit of a buff. We want to have a game where in your local community, if there are 3 Wadroon players, we want to see those guys being a bit diverse. We want to say, oh, that's Bobby over there. He plays the Wadroon where the Scion's the Warlord, and he likes that style because it's just as powerful, and he wins 50% of the time against Johnny over here, who uses just the Chief Warlord every game. And you've got 2 very different Wadroon players, rather than them both playing the carbon copy Matriarch Queen with Braves, with 1 Tonto, 1 Apex, 1 unit of Slingers, and just the exact same cookie cutter build. To prevent that, you want to address the supremacy abilities and do that right across the board with every faction. And just make sensible changes to the Warlord supremacy abilities that aren't really as good. I'd strongly recommend taking a look at that. Thirdly, I just want to talk about scenarios a little bit. I want to praise them for scenarios. I think the scenarios are very, very good. I just coming away from other game systems like War Machine Hordes and Infinity especially, it's just so refreshing to come across scenarios which create very diverse gameplay and make it about the mission and make it interesting. It's awesome. There are just 2 scenarios I would want to tweak. One of them is called Foresight. We are in the middle of a tabletop simulator tournament with about 25 people at the moment, and I suggested that they remove this from the lineup. We're partway through the tournament, and nobody disagreed with me. Like, there were like a half a dozen people who came out immediately says, yes, I agree that we should remove this, and the guy running it, had to sort of acquiesce to that and remove it as well, popular demand. And it's because in this mission, you nominate one of the zones, and that's going to not count for scoring. And your opponent does the same, but you do it secretly. And if you both choose the same zone, it doubles it effectively. And the problem with that is that it's a little bit luck-based. So if you just by chance manage to double scoring on one of your regiments and your opponent's not getting the same, and that happens several turns in a row and it's a close game, it will have just come down to luck. And we don't really want more luck in this game. There's plenty of variance in this game. Some games that are very close are decided by dice. You want more of it decided by player decision. So I would definitely take that out of the Foresight mission or change it in some way. The other one, which I don't know if it really needs a change, but just a bit of a note that I've played Grind Them Down a few times. And when you get into the late game, what typically happens is because there's this mechanic where at the start of the turn you nominate a zone that has no troops in it, or no friendly troops, and if you move into it with a unit of your own and capture it and seize it, you get a bonus 3 points, which is a huge swing. So what ends up happening is that people, towards the end of the game, they clear one flank, and they have one regiment that just hangs out on the edge of the circle, reforms, then moves to the other circle, and they just ping-pong it between the 2 zones for a while. And I just don't know if that was an intended effect of the scenario. It really means that the best strategy for this is to just completely bulk towards one flank, try and slow them down on the other, and then fight over the center. And look, if you like that kind of scenario play, that's fine. I just feel like the additional points for getting a free zone like that is maybe a bit too much. I would attribute more points to having multiple zones, and you want to make it about sort of controlling the entire board rather than a small part of it. So yeah, those were my thoughts about the scenarios, but generally scenarios are good. I do want to talk a little bit about objective markers because at the moment they are quite exploitable. What I mean by that is that objectives completely become impossible for units. You can't end your move on top of it. So if you have an absolute crushing Death Star of a regiment, and there's an objective marker in between you and your opponent just simply moves up towards it, you can't physically place your regiment in contact with them, and it kind of slows the game down for a while until one player's destroyed the objective. I think that we should try playing missions where it's like a flat, plate on the ground, like on a baseball field where you make it to second base and it's just like this flat area that you move onto, rather than like a big pole, like a pillar that just blocks you from moving. That way you can still fight over it and you can still attack it, but it's just this flat thing on the ground, in the same way that an objective zone is a flat thing on the ground. And I think it would make the game more fun, because at the moment the obstruction of an objective zone doesn't really feel good when somebody's successfully exploiting it against you. And when you exploit it against an opponent, it does feel a bit hollow. So, and I don't think it's a great new player experience either. So I think that I would recommend that fix. All right, shall we just move on to the fun stuff now, which is the faction balance thoughts. Again, I'm not going to go through every single detail, but I'm going to spend a little bit of time on every faction, and we're just going to work our way through them, starting with 100 Kingdoms. So, as everybody knows, Ashen Dawn have been a problem in the meta for a while, and they've received several nerfs, 1 or 2 nerfs, I believe. So they're now up 250 points, but the thing is, this kind of warband here, I mean, I know that most people really prefer the Sealed Temple, so I suppose we should be talking about this warband here. I like the Crimson Towers personally, but this is the warband that you kind of feel obligated to gravitate towards as a 100 Kingdoms player. There is an argument out there that the sort of triple block style of lots of infantry, like a massive unit of Gilded Legion, massive unit of Household Guard, massive unit of Militia, plus a lot of screening units, that's the right way to play 100 Kingdoms. I don't know if it is the right way to play 100 Kingdoms. I don't know if it would really do very well against Old Dominion at the moment, and secondarily, the number of minutes you have to buy and assemble sort of is a bit off-putting to a lot of people to treat that as the most competitive build. So what people do with 100 Kingdoms is they typically just go Priority Commander on horse, and they take 2 units of either Sealed Temple or Crimson Tower, and then 2 units of Ashen Dawn. Some people take larger units of Ashen Dawn, like 4 or 5. It has become very expensive to do that now, but people are still doing it because it just is so much stronger than a lot of other 100 Kingdom stuff that you can take, and it's just very hard for your opponent to deal with. They are a massively powerful anvil in terms of, defensively taking the punches, but they're a massively powerful hammer as well because of their high stats. Clash 4 attack, 6 cleave 1. They can be blessed, obviously. The only tweak that I'd make, given that they've already been nerfed a couple of times, is to actually now go to the Priority Commander and say that the Priority Commander gives the entire warband Blessed. We already do that, but when you're adding Blessed to a unit that already has Blessed, which is the Ashen Dawn, they don't have the choice of +1 attack and Hardened. Let's just give them Hardened. That way you eliminate this situational thing where people can go, oh, okay, looks like I have won the Supremacy roll. I'm going to attack the thing in front of me, and I'm going to do 7 attacks, and I'm going to use Blessed on the attacks, and it's just going to be absolutely murderous. Let's just make it so that they act more like an anvil overall, rather than having like both rolls, and tone down the attacking roll of them slightly, and they're still going to be very, very good. You're not going to nerf them to ground by doing that. It's just another small tweak in the correct direction. And then what you can do is you could make, for example, Order of the Crimson Tower a bit stronger, either by reducing their points or, dare I say it, make them cause more damage. They're supposed to be the premier impact hits unit in the game, but they are kind of a bit lackluster in the sense that they don't really inflict as much damage as you would like. They're already hitting half the time. You need to commit a lot more to them in terms of buffs or use Blessed to get those attacks done, and they don't typically kill their points worth of stuff when they charge. And then once they get attacked themselves, you do lose them. So I think that their banner should be cheaper, for example, or maybe find some way for them to do a little bit more damage. I would like to see them just sort of become that role for 100 Kingdoms where they do the punching at the moment. It's Order of the Ashen Dawn, which kind of do more of the damage, so to speak, and I'd prefer it to be the other way around. So with 100 Kingdoms, Chapter Mage, I think, is another one I wanted to talk about. So let's go and investigate. Chapter Mage has had some changes. We now have the Water School being very, very good because just of how much healing it does. When you check it out, it's not actually scaling. So you can have a massive unit, you can heal 3 wounds plus per success. So once you get focused up and running, you're going to be healing maybe 7 or 8 wounds, which could be a couple of stands, which is really, really good. And if you make her the Warlord, and you don't always want to do that, she can always heal Gilded Legion or Steel Legion or Household Guard, and that makes her very, very viable. So I like the direction she's been taken in, but we still have these ones, School of Earth, School of Air, which really are lackluster. School of Earth just needs like a 3rd spell in there, which does something that is going to be useful to you every round, for example. Something to buff, like a friendly regiment to make them more durable or something like that. Just something that she can do reliably every round so that when you don't have an awesome opportunity to cast one of these other two abilities, you've still got a way to make her worthwhile. School of Air is unfortunately only going to be on crossbowmen, unless you make her the Warlord, in which case you're investing quite a lot to get her to do more stuff to longbowmen, who aren't really that great in the first place. What I would love to see for the Chapter Mage is just an upgrade to her warband where she gets a couple of restrict units. For example, if you make longbowmen restricted and you make like squires or something restricted, she just becomes a bit more useful and interesting in the sense that she's got more stuff that she can actually cast on her warband in terms of School of Air, or just have access to something that you don't necessarily need to take the Noble Lord or the Imperial Officer for. Steel Legion would be really cool as well, or just something that you can go in other than Men at Arms for the water abilities. But yeah, we need to take her in a better direction overall. But they're getting there. In terms of shooting units, so if we go over to the officer, he can. He previously had this thing where the rangers could actually cart him around very well with fluid formation because he could give them, double time basically, which is really good. But they can't really score anymore. And the officer becomes light when he joins them. I mean, at Volley 3, they're kind of cool at shooting, but they don't have any armor piercing, which is why people typically just take crossbowmen instead, because they're a lot cheaper. One idea that I had for Rangers is that what you could do is give them a very, very expensive officer that costs like 15 to 20 points that gives them the ability to have like a draw event, for example, where their character stand, their command stand, gains +1 stand for scoring. Because so many other factions have access to this, where you play Dwegum and you have Rancor from the Keroueg, you play Sorcerer Kings and you have the sorcerer ability that gives the goals, scoring, and Spires have the ability to do it. The Jarl from Nords has like a supremacy ability. So I don't think it's very fair that they've given the early game scoring to like most factions, but taken it away from 100 Kingdoms specifically. So imagine Ranger Corps with a draw event, which makes their command stand +1 stand for scoring. That would allow you in turn 2, and not turn 1 because it's a draw event. In turn 2, you could move on to a zone and start capping it, and that sort of gives the Rangers actually some value. The second thing it would do, if it was an officer upgrade, would mean that they have access to veterans. So let's imagine it costs 15 points just for that early game scoring. You turn it into a 30-point upgrade, which is a really, really serious investment, but it could give the entire regiment +1 volley, making them volley 4, which is crazy. You could aim volley on 5s, which is kind of nutty, but remembering that they don't have armor piercing. So they become these absolute shredders of other light units and so forth, and that makes them really, really scary, but you have to pay the points for that. So I think that would be really kind of interesting. You'd have the Imperial Officer going into them, giving them Eye of Acalis, giving them Fire in Advance, giving them that terrifying sort of short-range resolve check shooting. They'd turn into a really nasty unit, but I don't think they would be on the level of Bow Chosen and Slingers at the moment. So you're not going to break the game by doing that. The massive investment that you'd be putting into that would take away from a lot of other stuff you'd have in your list, and I think it would be perfectly fine. I also think you could do a similar thing with longbowmen. You could have an officer upgrade, which could then make the veterans for the +1 volley. Because their barrage is so low, I just think that they're still not going to be powerful enough to break the game. But at the moment, units like that need a bit more help, because at the moment, people are competitively, they're just going straight for Ashen Dawn and just other stuff in general, Guild Legion, whatever they can get their hands on. People aren't really running Rangers and Longbows anymore, which is kind of sad. Like, they're a really interesting unit. Okay, the other thing I want to say about 100 Kingdoms is just character upgrades. Some of them just don't see a lot of play. Art of War, I just don't see people finding any value out of it. Rally to me, I don't see any value out of it. It's just like an expense which you can't really afford to take. I really would like them to go through and just fix up some of these abilities which people aren't really using very well. I mean, finite state apparatus, it's just like a one-off use. It's just not great. Yeah, they need to sort of go back and tweak some of these abilities. Shall we move on then? So next on my list I have Spires, which I won't talk about too much because I haven't had that much experience with Spires. I have played them a bit now and played against them. Uh, so the one thing I see in the Spire's army list every single game is Cascading Degeneration, because it's just this very cheap, free ability to give you Aura of Death 4. It's just such a reliable ability. What I'd like to see with that is just to have it toned down a bit, so that you're not just constantly playing around it. I think we could reduce this to 30 points down from 35, and we could make it Aura of Death 3. That way, it just doesn't become this massively pivotal thing, which kind of, either your opponent has to completely ignore and play around, or it becomes game-winning if they just shove a unit down your throat and you're taking that many hits from it. I just don't really feel like the game needs that much Aura of Death. We see it a lot with Old Dominion, we see it a lot with Dweghom, we see it a lot with obviously Cascading Degeneration, of course. And it's not one of the more interesting and fun things about the game. It's kind of like something which your opponent just sort of really shoves at you, and there's not a lot of thought involved. It's the kind of ability which absolutely trashes low defense units and doesn't really have the impact against high defense units. So I guess it's interesting in that sense, but I just don't think it would be. I don't think it should be so extreme, is what I mean. The other thing about the Lineage Highborn is that we always see her using the same mutations. I always say this. So Cascading Degeneration, Command Pheromones, Pheromantic Override. Those are the three upgrades that she takes when she is Legacy of the Ark as the Warlord. I really feel like we just need to go through and reduce Pheromantic Override, obviously, because that's just like a sickeningly powerful ability, and she shouldn't get like a free 60-point thing. But we should be going through and changing some of these other upgrades just to make them a bit more useful, in my opinion. And I think bringing back duels would help with that a little bit. Prideborn is the new character that just came out. People are saying that she's kind of not as good as the basic Lineage Highborn, and I agree. I think that although on paper she looks pretty deadly with massive speed, AP2 deadly shot, it's a massive point sink, and as soon as you get into close combat, you're not going to really do that well. And when you're shooting at stuff like Praetorians with Eternal Discipline, or Dweghom with some of the stuff that they've got, or anything with loose formation, things in forests, you're going to find yourself not really getting a lot of value out of these guys. They are a bit expensive. They are very new, though, so I guess Parabellum hasn't really seen the data on them yet. But I suspect they need a little bit of a buff. Another unit which I don't really see people using are Onslaught drones for some reason, and Desolation drones are the other new ones, so we'll come back to them in a second. Onslaught drones are the line infantry type guys which have burnout naturally, and burnout is kind of a tough ability to use on a unit which is quite brittle, quite fragile. I think that burnout is a great ability on a unit like Centaur Avatar, because they're going to benefit from the clash and the march extremely well. Like, it allows them to get that charge clash off, and the impact hits are going to benefit from the clash, and the clash is going to benefit from the +1 clash, obviously. So that's where burnout can be very, very powerful. Same with a unit like a regiment like the Siegebreaker with Smite. Giving it +1 clash is going to mean more hits, which goes straight through. But on just a basic pleb unit, which doesn't do a lot of damage, they have Linebreaker, but they don't have any cleave or anything like that, and they just clash 2. I feel like that's just not particularly useful. So I'd like to see Onslaught drones get a little bit of a tweak. Desolation drones are the other ones that have just come out, and on paper, I think a lot of people look forward to the idea of shooting with them and using the -1 defense to then follow up with an attack on an enemy unit. Like, okay, the Prideborn then shoot them, or the Avatar then attack them. The problem with that, to me, is that it's just too slow in terms of tempo. Like, if you've got that beautiful target lined up, the opponent's got their 5 Ashen Dawn in front of you, and you move in with your Desolation drones, and you just clip them with reprocessing agents, and then you're expecting to bring in another unit to attack the Ashen Dawn. Well, your opponent is going to get a chance to then activate their card, aren't they? So the Ashen Dawn just charge you and wipe you out. If you're running the Executor and you get the Supremacy ability where you've got 3 cards going at once, yes, it could be okay, but what if you don't win the Supremacy roll? I mean, the unit that's in front of you is still going to attack and do the damage before you get to really jump into them. So Desolation drones, I think for 170 points, I don't particularly love them. The barrage is very short-ranged as well, so you've got to move 5, shoot 12. That's 17 inches total. Not bad, but they are going to get outranged by a lot of other stuff in the game, and if it becomes a shootout between them and slingers, or even just mercenary crossbowmen, you're going to lose them very quickly. They're not very well defended. And a spell, like a fireball from a Dweg sorcerer, at Resolve 3 Defense 1, these guys are just going to get cleaned up very, very fast. And you've got a 170-point unit that you invested in that. So I kind of question their points cost a little bit. I'd like to see that that reduced. Lastly, the assassin. I think that he is fine so long as they fix duels. Like if you make it much more of a penalty to decline a duel, then the assassin suddenly becomes something which would actually see a bit of play. My idea of giving you a free clash if your opponent declines, that could be kind of cool, because then you can give him the mutations, which give him more attacks and more damage or whatever he's able to take, and he starts to become a real blender. So that would be really, really cool. There's more about spies that I've probably missed, but I am going to move on just because I don't play spies that much. We're going to talk about Dwegum. In a very recent video, I went into a lot more detail about Dwegum, so we're just going to go over my main points that I made for Dwegum. I feel like the Elemental, the Tempered Creed thing is just so much stronger than Ardent Creed that they do need to rework it. I would like to see it that rather than auto-passing the dice roll by spending the elemental token, you just either just get a reroll or something to that effect, and buff it in some other way to make up for that, rather than it just being a pure like a no-brainer, scooping up the tokens and completely surviving that attack. That's what I would prefer to see. I think the other way to go would just be to mildly nerf it, but improve the Ardent Creed a little bit. We just want to get to a point where both kind of styles are a bit more balanced. That would make Dwegum a much more interesting faction to build lists for and to collect the miniatures for, in my opinion. What else do we have for Dwegum? I think the Rag needs a Supremacy ability buff. This guy just doesn't really contribute to the battle very much. This is kind of situational. If you're on an objective zone with the Rag, surely you should be able to fight your way onto it and win it regardless, rather than just towing the corner and just always scoring. I don't feel like this does enough to be a good alternative over the Sorcerer. We also need to reduce the points of his Thanes and his Dragon Slayers. This is generally agreed by most people that I talk to, is that these two units, they are kind of slow, they are kind of a little bit vulnerable to certain things, and they cost a ton of points. So seeing their I mean, even the standards are very expensive as well. Just seeing some reductions in points cost, we can then bring it back the way of the Combat Dwegum list, which you really want that to be an iconic sort of viable thing, rather than Dwegum just being a gun line every single game, which is what we do see in tournament play. People just are still showing up with Fireforged and Sorcerers riding Drakes every single time, from what I see. The Ironclad, though, one thing you can do is build the Rag with the Initiates, and instead of having him as the Warlord, he's just this guy that unlocks the Drake with the Initiates and has Dragobrood, and that's just like a very cookie-cutter build. We want to see other, items being brought into play, in my opinion, but this is just the one that everybody uses. Dragobrood fueled by the Fergus in the Initiates. Then you take an Ironclad Drake, which is very aggressively costed. It's much better than the Dragon Slayers for 220 points. So I think if you're going to make any changes, either you buff the Dragon Slayers and the Thanes, or you reduce the Ironclad Drake a little bit. It just does a little bit too much for its cost. I know that not every Dweg player will be happy to hear me say that, but I do feel like it's a little bit too much at the moment. And lastly, Hold Warriors. I think they need some love. Hold Warriors are a thing which have become affected by power creep, really, is that everybody else is getting such cool stuff. When you come back to the Hold Warriors, a lot of the time, all they're going to do is just going to camp one objective zone, and doing it for 130 points, they just get blown out of the water by Men-at-Arms and Legionnaires. because if you're not going to see any combat with them, these guys don't really benefit from the additional wound and the additional point of defense in some cases, and the really cool officers that they can take. Obviously, these do a lot of the things, but you've got to pay a lot of points for them. And at 130, I think that's too much. We got to bring them down to like 120 and make the additional stands a little bit cheaper. I actually thought it would be really cool in Last Argument if they bring out a special rule, which they will give only to line infantry units like this, where if you take a certain number of stands, then the special rule kicks in. Like, imagine if you get +1 impact if your unit is more than 6 stands, but you only give that upgrade to hold warriors and like men-at-arms and onslaught drones and blooded and things that people typically don't take massive units of, just to reward people who want to be a bit different and play that kind of style where they have the most basic crappy unit in the faction, but they have a lot of them, they're led by a really cool combat character, and they've got something to show for it when they build a unit that big. Maybe give them Fearless, like if they make it 6 stands or Impact 1 or whatever it might be, but just something to incentivize that kind of build, because we don't really see that. It just doesn't really work in competitive play. Okay, shall we move on to Nords as our next faction? Nords are in an interesting place at the moment. Nords, if you take the exact right build and you're one of the better players around and know exactly what you're doing, Nords are really like an S-tier faction. They're very, very strong. But for everybody else, they're very, very weak because they do fall apart quite easily. My complaint really is that the Shaman and the Jarl have the best supremacy abilities. Everybody else kind of sucks. And the other complaint really is that the Bow Chosen are by far the best regiment in the faction. And like, I do mean by far. Like, they really are in every single competitive list, and most people take 2 of them. Some people take 1 regiment of 3 and 1 regiment of like 4 or 5. And it's primarily, in my opinion, because of this thing here, precise shot, where you're just firing so many arrows at Barrage 5 that you're going to get a lot of ones eventually, and you're going to be removing stands of things that have defense 4. So your opponent is rolling along with their defense 4 regiment of whatever it might be, Ashen Dawn or Knights or some kind of thing like that, and they're just getting absolutely wrecked. And I don't think that is correct. I think that Bow Chosen should have a counter, like your simple unit of Household Knights should be a counter to Bow Chosen. They really aren't, because to get into March charge range, you're typically going to allow the Bow Chosen a chance to shoot you at least once. They do have a reasonably good chance of actually breaking you by stripping off like 2 stands. And then if you do get into combat with them, if they have a Blooded, the Blooded is like Cleave 2, and the unit's actually very good at fighting. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Maybe bring their combat ability down a bit, or take their wounds from 5 to 4. You can make those changes, but I personally would just change precise shot. I would make it so that instead of reducing your defense to 0 if you roll a 1, you just count that particular hit as an AP2 hit. So if you're shooting something which has defense 4, it becomes defense 2 for those rolls of a 1. For everything else, you're rolling at defense 4. So that just sort of takes the edge off a little bit. It still means that Bow Chosen are extremely powerful. People will still use Bow Chosen, but it sort of brings the most powerful Nords list down a little bit, just where everybody else is. And that would make the game a little bit more interesting, a bit fairer, and you'd see possibly some more varied Nords lists, and sometimes people wouldn't take them. That's a good thing. You don't want to see them in every single list. The other nerf that I would give, and this is a very mild nerf, is just with the Jarl in particular. I think the Jarl supremacy ability is cool, but where it says light regiments with a character stand currently attached to them can seize territory, I would restrict that so that you only get maybe 1 or even 2 light regiments per turn able to take advantage of that, in the same way that the Imperial officer can only use 2 units with Vanguard every turn. What you're currently seeing is that some people are taking the Jarl and the Raiders and then Blooded in a unit of Bow Chosen, then another unit of Blooded in a Bow Chosen, and all 3 of them are moving onto the board with flank, and they're just running straight for the objectives, and they're scoring 1 billion points in the early game. And then in the late game, yes, you're killing the Nords and you're eventually beating them on material, but they've just got so many points, you were never going to win that matchup. So by just limiting that part of the Jarl supremacy ability, I think that you still keep it viable, but you just sort of soften that one Nord's build, which everybody seems to be kind of gravitating towards when you're playing at the competitive level, and that would be fairer. I don't know if you guys realize this, but I had the nasty sort of realization recently that opportunists work on volley actions as well. So what that means is that when you cross the middle of the battlefield and you get into combat with the Nords, they can shoot you in the flank with a unit of bow chosen or stalkers or whatever it might be and get rerolls, which is absolutely crushing. So the Jarl supremacy ability is still very, very good. I'm not suggesting we mess with that part of it, but if we take away their ability to just get 1 billion points in turn 2, whatever it might be, it just makes the game fairer. While we're on the topic of Nords, though, I think Nords also need a lot of buffs in other areas. For example, the other supremacy abilities. Let's talk in particular about the Konungur. So the Konungur is really cool. He's sort of like an iconic guy, and he's sort of what you imagine when you are a new player to Conquest and you think, oh, Nords are the beat face faction. They are the Vikings. They charge across at you and they're bloodthirsty berserkers. But they actually play a bit more like wood elves. They're kind of sticking to forests. They are shooting at you. They're skirmishing and they're trying to outmaneuver you. And that's actually how Nords play competitively, which is kind of weird. I think it should be possible. Like if you want to, as a Nords player, there should be this option you can reach to on the shelf, which allows you to be the beat face kind of faction where you're taking more advantage of Blood of the Einjar. So I think the Konungur should get a change to a supremacy ability. At the moment, +1 terrifying is awful. It doesn't work on Old Dominion at all. Doesn't work on enemy units that have bravery and fearless, etc. And you can't really rely on this to do much work. What I think the Konungur could do is he could be a bit more like the Polemarch, where the Polemarch just has some buffs for the regiment he's in, and that's it. So if you have the Konungur leading a unit of Huskarls or Steel Chosen, or when they come out, then if he makes that unit better at fighting, and you have this sort of really buff combat unit, like a Death Star of a combat unit you can charge towards the enemy with, that becomes like a different style, for the Nords. And I'd love to sort of see that and see the Konungur as a warlord sometimes, but not all of the time. So that would be really fun. And also, this comes back to my very first point in the video, and it sort of reiterates why it's a very important point, is that dueling, once it gets fixed, the Konungur becomes a bit more interesting because he's probably the best duelist in the game once you tool him up. So a change to duels just has all these repercussions and ramifications throughout the game, which would be good. Love to see it. Elsewhere, the Ulfednar and the Bearsarks unfortunately got absolutely shafted when the Gothy got removed. So previously, if you're new, by the way, they have Savage at the moment, which is not particularly helpful. The Gothy was another officer they could have, which would give them Blessed. And you can see how much difference that makes to a unit like this, right? They are so good at bashing you in the face, but to get into combat and survive that charge from you or the shooting or whatever, well, not that Blessed helps because of the shooting, but to get in the position to make use of their devastating ability of Cleave 2 Linebreaker, you need them to sort of survive, and Blessed was really doing that. And the Ulfednar, they have not been a viable unit ever, pretty much. They look so cool on paper, and they're such a Nordy unit. They're so quintessentially Nords. It's a shame that they sort of don't get picked over a basic unit like Ugars, for example. You want them to do something a little bit different. You want them to do something that's really worthwhile, and you want them to epitomize the sort of beat face, like axis swinging nature of the faction, but everybody just shifts back to like Fenner and Bow Chosen and Jotnars now. It's not so much the heavy infantry, and that's an absolute shame. I really detest that. So we either need to bring the Gothy back, or even better, we need to give them a different officer upgrade, which makes them different from Ugars and makes them really, really punchy and powerful and fun and interesting. I think maybe a change to the way that Bloodlust works. They were already teasing that with Sorcerer Kings. Bloodlust being something which allows you to charge off the table, but once you're on the table, they become less reliable. We've got to see some changes to that so that Ulfednar and Bearsarks come back into the meta. I'd really like to see that. And when I say come back into the meta, they were never in the meta. I mean, like, let's bring them in. Let's give them a chance to shine. Give them some teeth. So Varga, Wargs, Volva, Valkyries are on my little list of notes there. I don't see them used competitively for some reason, and I think that reason is that they're too expensive, and because like the bow chosen sort of style of Nords is just too much. The Varga Lord is kind of cool. I really like this idea of like the Varga Lord taking the Redbringer blade, which gives bloodlust, and putting him in a unit of like Fenners, making the Fenners like a massive unit. That would allow you to then take the Shaman Warlord, who gives Vanguard. What you could then do is march onto the table 7 inches, charge 7 plus d6, and then clash because of Bloodlust, and the Varga gives the Finners that, and he gives them Flurry as well. So that's devastating, but of course, after you've done that, they've only got 4 wounds, they're Evasion 2, Resolve 2, this guy's Resolve 3, and they just die. I mean, it's a fun idea, but I just don't see it really working very well. And with the Volva, she's got a really cool list of spells, but I just don't really see her either being the kind of unit that packs a lot of punch. The Valkyries don't have cleave, they just clash 3, they've got 4 attacks, they don't really like beat a lot of face, even with Blessed, and they don't really tank very well either, because they're defense 2 plus shield, and with the Blessed with the rerolls, you're still going to get absolutely trashed by Linebreaker and Cleave. The Blessed then sort of doesn't become as viable. They've got 4 wounds each and Resolve 3. They're not fearless, and they just absolutely get murdered by Old Dominion. I once played a game where I ran a Tauntaur into them and just completely deleted the unit because the Tauntaur takes them down to defense 1. He hits them a million times, then he tramples on them, and they, you know, they take resolve checks for all of that. So let me know if you guys are having a lot of success with the Volva and the Valkyries. I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing Nord players use it, and I don't think about reaching to that unit when I build Nord's lists. That's such a cool looking unit. Like, I love the miniatures for the Valkyries, but I just don't really see it there. Let's move on to Wadroon. I love Wadroon. They are probably my main faction for Tabletop Simulator. I play 100 Kingdoms with my real army, though. Wadroon are apparently, it's rumored that they're going to get a rework for their chant system, and they need it. The problem, well, there's a few problems. Problem number 1, I think, with war chants is that people who play this faction competitively are relying on the Conquest cult and the War cult, and we never use the Death cult or the Famine cult. And that is because, obviously, Conquest is ubiquitous, everybody gets to use it, but it actually has some very useful movement buffs anyway. And War has, like, every tier of it has the most useful abilities, which are the most practical. At the basic tier, you get +1 defense, which can be used in a lot of different situations by every regiment in your faction. You can always use defense. Your unit's always going to take hits. It's going to be something which is applicable for the remainder of the turn. It allows you to march, charge, and then take less damage. It allows you to take less damage against shooting. It means that you're going to take less wounds, therefore less resolve checks. So when you compare that to +1 clash from death, which you may not need because you may have shock, you may have high clash anyway, or with famine, which is charge distance and shock, you can get shock from the chief warlord anyway. The charge distance isn't usually as viable. War sort of wins at tier 1, and then when you get to tier 2, you get resolve and cleave, like 2 different things there, whereas at death you just get flawless strikes, at famine you just get relentless blows. So War again wins at tier 2. Cleave is so important. And then at tier 3, counterattack, not very important, but Blessed is important because you're already +1 defense, and then when you're getting rerolls on top of that, it just makes a unit of Braves or something like that so tanky. Whereas with Death, Untouchable, and Deadly Blades, you don't really... you don't really need it as badly. You sort of need a way to sort of for your unit to survive and actually to do that damage a lot of the time. And with Famine, because it's so hard to get Fanatic now, you can't really get this on your Thunder Riders. The best you can really do is a unit of Braves, maybe that have Death's Gaze, and even then, they are just not really getting enough done with it. I mean, on paper, I know it probably seems to new players like that looks really good, but I've seen it in practice. I've tried it out. It doesn't really have the oomph that it does for the investment that you're putting into it. So what we're seeing then is everybody is just using War and Conquest. What I would like to see one way to fix this is to swap some of the bonuses that you get from the war chance with some of the ones from death and famine. So, for example, war could be that the tier 1 ability is swapped with the tier 2 ability, so you get +1 resolve and cleave at tier 1, and you get the +1 defense at tier 2, which makes it a lot harder to sort of just continue dishing it out to units that need it. At the moment, what you can do is, if you have no chance in the sequence, you can start your turn with a character and a regiment in that order. The character chance of war, the regiment chance for war. They're activating immediately before your enemy activates. You're getting +1 defense straight away for the rest of the turn, and that's sort of the way it works. The other thing that is like a defining thing about W'adrun as a faction is that it's sort of like building an army list and a game plan and a strategy is really about how much fanatic can you get, how can you get your regiments to tier 3. And at the moment there are some ways to do it, like your character wins a duel, for example, just things like that. The matriarch supremacy ability grants it, and you can get it from mantle, from the item, and there are some like chosen units which can do it. But anytime you can get something to tier 3, that's where like you're getting the leverage from in this faction. And that is why people are typically taking the matriarch queen as their warlord. They're taking mantle of the devoted on like a chief or a unit of like the predator with the slingers. And we'll get to that in a minute. And that's sort of what it becomes. One interesting idea that I had is that you could change it so that instead of having a maximum 3 chant cards in the sequence, you maximize it at 4 cards, and you give everybody the ability to get to tier 3, not just the ones that have Fanatic. And if you do have Fanatic, it just means that when you chant, you just add 2 markers instead of 1. And what you're trying to do is to get to tier 4, get 4 markers to then chant for tier 3. That's how it would work. And everybody would have access to it, but you wouldn't have access to it as reliably and frequently. So if you start the turn with no markers in the sequence at all, activate your Predator, chance for Conquest, activate your Slingers, chance for 2 Conquest because they are Fanatics. You'd have 3 cards, and that would allow you to get to tier 2 rather than tier 3. You'd have to start with more cards in play to get to that point, so it wouldn't become this automatic, reliable thing where your Fanatic unit just goes from 0 to 100 miles an hour in one particular play. And I think that would require more planning and thought and preparation for W'adrun. W'adrun at the moment are a top tier faction, top 3 for sure, because of their reliability of just getting Fanatic units to tier 3 straight away. If you're going to make it possible for every unit in the army to get to tier 3, you would then have to tone down tier 3 a little bit. So for Conquest, that gives you a triple action, right? If we were going to go with this system of war chants, in my opinion, I think it would be best to make it so that the tiers are not cumulative. You have to pick one. So if you're tier 3 war, you do get Blessed and Counterattack, but you miss out on Cleave and +1 defense. So it's definitely not as strong to get to tier 3. If you get to tier 3 Conquest, you get 3 actions, but you miss out on +2 Evasion, you miss out on +3 March Distance. But your Tauntaur can still March, Charge, Clash. I think that would be fine. I think it would be okay to go back to that kind of meta, because it would be much harder for the Tauntaur to get to that point. You couldn't just reliably have that happen. You'd have to very carefully engineer that situation with all of your other regiments like chanting the songs and getting you to that point. That's always the way I imagine the W'adrun to work. And most people, when they start the faction, they learn about the faction, they think, oh, that's how the faction plays. In reality, at the moment, it doesn't play that way. You're just sort of alternating between chanting for tier 1 war and then just like chanting for some more cards. And then when your Fanatic unit shows up, they just go straight to tier 3. And it's just a matter of your faction sometimes having +1 defense, sometimes having 3 actions. And that's just generally the way that the faction is played. The other thing about W'adrun is that they have this combo right now, which is really kind of a crutch combo, which is where you specifically take 1 Predator and a unit of Slingers. You can take War if you want to, but the main thing is that Teaching of Conquest is going to give you Voice of Conquest, giving you the Cult of Conquest as your main sort of chant here, and he's going to join the Slingers, which is going to make them a Voice of Conquest, Cult of Conquest unit as well. You then take Mantle of the Devoted to give the Slingers Fanatic, and you take Ceaseless Hunt to give them Fire in Advance. If you want to, you can take Marksmanship if you can afford it. And then what you do is you go to slingers, you typically give them flint napper, and then you've got this little combo here. So 165 for the predator, 175 for the slingers. It's a massive investment, but it's an absolutely shockingly powerful investment because it means that when it's your turn to play, you draw your predator card. The predator creates a conquest chant marker. Then you immediately activate the slingers because the predator is in the slingers regiment. You're allowed to then go to your next regiment that he's part of. They draw their card. They chant for conquest. You now have 2 cards in the sequence. You then chant the battle cry. So those two tokens would normally allow you to get you to tier 1. But because you're fanatic, you're chanting conquest always, and 2 cards count for tier 3 if you're fanatic. That's just how the rules work apparently. You then move the slingers. They are speed 9 because you get plus 3 inches on your first march from tier 1 conquest. They are plus 2 evasion, by the way, but they get 3 actions. So they move 9, they move another 6, and they shoot you. Or they move 9, they aim to get volley 4, and they shoot you with reroll 6s, which does a ton of damage, and then they can move back with their fire in advance ability. No, they can't do that actually. Fire in advance only works if you shoot with your second action. So you move, you shoot, you move back again with fire in advance, which means you can come with an 18 for your guns, and then you pull back 6 inches fully, which totally keeps you out of arm's reach. You can do it turn after turn after turn. Or if you want to, there's this other play where you move 9 inches and then you move another 6 inches and then you volley them from absolute point blank range where you get effective range. That means the slingers are going to fire 16 shots, and they've got this thing here where they've got torrential fire, which means that for each 2 hits you get an additional hit, and it causes volley, causes morale checks as well. So you might be busting them with like 20 hits at this point, which they take morale checks from. It's kind of disgusting, and that kind of thing just deletes enemy units, and it's so miserable to play against that kind of build when you don't really have an answer for it. And in competitive play, that's something which Wadroon players are using now. You don't actually have to take Mantle on the Predator if you don't want to. The Matriarch Queen as a Warlord can give it to the Predator. One very nasty, sickening build that I've come up with lately is to actually have the Matriarch in the Braves and have 2 Predators, each with their own Slingers unit. One of them has Mantle, and the other one's going to benefit from the Matriarch Supremacy, giving them Fanatic, and they're both just going at it, bouncing off each other, cross-firing, and you can still afford, Apex Predators and stuff like that. So yeah, I think Wadroon do need some changes to the chance system for sure. I think the Slingers, Apex, and Tauntaur probably all need very slight nerfs. They're very strong. The Tauntaur has been nerfed in the past. It's just impossible to stop him from getting at least 1 clash action, and he can really run away with the game. And with Chanting Conquest, speed 9 plus 6 is given a really awesome threat range. With the Apex Predator, he used to be too weak, and then they buffed him with additional wounds and movement. So it's just very hard to stop this guy from getting a charge clash off on you because he's so quick. So we do see a lot of them in the meta. It's really awesome that the most interesting and fun models in the game are powerful, but I do feel like they need a very slight tweak in that direction. Thunder Riders, I think, possibly need a very slight buff. They used to be very, very powerful with Mantle of the Devoted, but you can't use that on them anymore. So if we're not changing the chance system to benefit them, I think they need a points decrease very slightly because they're a little bit flimsy. Ultimately, I would have thought that this would be the unit that benefits the most from Famine, but they really don't. They're better off with War because getting up to Defense 4 is more important than having the extra charge range. And there's no way to get them to Famine Tier 3, which is a really fun one, giving them an Impact 6 and Glorious Charge. That is awesome, but they just can't do it anymore, so less exciting, unfortunately. Very fun faction. Wadroon are a very good place competitively. Speaking of very good place competitively, we're going to go to our next one, which is Old Dominion. I talk about Old Dominion every video. I know you guys are sick of me talking about Old Dominion, so let's just quickly go through it. They are the #1 faction in the game at the moment, the most powerful. What we need to do to fix that is Legionnaires. These guys need to cost an additional 5 points, and the Standard Bearer needs to cost 5 points. Something to that effect, maybe more. That might not be enough of a nerf to them. These guys just walk onto the board 17 inches with Optio and the banner, and they just start scoring from turn 2. And as soon as you kill them, they get a bunch of dark power. If you don't kill them, they even attack you. They've got Terrifying. everybody knows that the Legionnaires are busted at the moment, and their supremacy ability means that you can't sort of outscore them in the early game, and then in the late game, Old Dominion just trash you with tier 3, tier 4, the Dark Power. Bone Golems are kind of ubiquitous. Everybody's taking them. All we need to do here, guys, is just to add a small points increase. I think +5 for the base and +5 for the additional thing, and just work that way. I will pause here and say that apparently they're bringing in a new rule called Brittle, which is the opposite of Tenacious. It means that if you roll 10 armor saves and 10 defense rolls and you pass 5 of them, you've got to turn 1 success into a failure. So if somebody's trying to plink you with all of these different spells and shooting attacks, you're taking much more damage in the long run. So if lots of Old Dominion units are getting that rule, that will certainly be a way to help bring them back down to like normal, normal land level of competitive play, fair playing field. I think Legionnaires and Bone Golems could be 2 really good candidates for that brittle ability. So maybe they will add that instead of changing the points cost around. That will sort of mean that we have to go back to relying on a lot of shooting and stuff to deal with them, which is fine, but they definitely need to do something about it. The Foot Strategos at the moment, we've playtested this guy a lot, and we now see him like pretty much every game. It's just like every list looks like this. You've got the Strategos, and he's got From the Front, which brings them on turn 1, because they count as lights. I think he just should have forward force. It should just be flank. Bring these guys on tier 2. They're just so incredibly strong because they just tank all kinds of shooting, and then once you do get them in close combat, they've got Aura of Death 4 from this specific setup here. The banner of +4 Aura of Death, you take Aventine Armor for the Tenacious, and you take Eternal Discipline. And this is just the kind of setup that you always have, and he's the best Warlord, really. One very nasty thing you can do with the Supremacy abilities, you take them up to tier 2, they get Bastion as a draw event, and then your block of like 6 or 7 guys, you just get the free reform to turn them into a big long line. You twist the side of your line towards an oblique way towards your opponent. This part of the regiment is now closer to your regiment, so it's a less of a charge distance. They then swing into the charge. They do that before you attack. You then take all of the Aura of Death hits. It's just a very nasty thing to do and very hard thing to stop, and it just shouldn't be such an easy thing for Old Dominion to get away with. So they do need to look at that. I also think that the global faction ability does need to be changed. So instead of having the +1 power token per turn, I think that you should choose between this or this, just in the same way that 100 Kingdoms choose between veterans or relentless drills. You have to have one or the other faction buff. Old Dominion have 2 faction buffs together, which is +1 Dark Power a turn, +1 reinforcement rolls all the time. Just choose between one of them. Actually make that a meaningful, thoughtful decision when you play Old Dominion, when you build the lists. So we've been talking about really just wrecking Old Dominion with lots of nerfs, but they actually do need buffs. Let's go through and look at some of the things which need buffs. I think that Moroi are not really well priced, especially when compared to Bone Golems. They're fighting for that ultimate slot in the Archimandrite's warband. Moroi should be less expensive, or their spells should do something a bit more effective. Let's make them a bit more like that. Athanatoi is another one where they got counterattack, that got changed to parry. Parry is actually worse. Enemy stands can't use flurry, etc., that kind of thing, the rerolls. It just isn't really enough to stop these guys from getting wrecked. They're just wounds for defense too. It's not enough. It's just, they're way too expensive. What I would do is I would change counterattack again. So take parry away, give them counterattack back, but change the counterattack rule so that when you roll a defense roll of a 1, rather than it causing a hit to your opponent, make it cause a hit that can't be saved. Like, it's an automatic wound to your opponent. That gives them a bit more bite. It makes them a bit scarier. It gives them a better brawler sort of value. And it would help to buff Order of the Sword in 100 Kingdoms, which is an unreleased unit, but they're currently a little bit underpowered. That kind of change to counterattack, making it more meaningful, make it a bit stronger, starts to gravitate towards Athanatoi becoming a bit more viable. I think they'll probably need a points decrease in the process. We also had Hashashins released along with the Acolytes. I think Acolytes are okay because they give you that turn 1 play. I think that makes them kind of interesting. Cultists is what I mean, sorry. And Hashashins, though, I just don't really see their viability. They are a bit flimsy. They're a very expensive unit, and you've got to get that charge clash off. And even then, at clash 2, it looks like attack 7 is going to be absolutely crazy. But yeah, at that low clash value, I don't really see you getting much use of it. I think that they need to have a points reduction, or the officers should do something a bit more to their damage potential, because remember, you're investing here in a unit that doesn't really add dark power at all. So you've got to bear that in mind. I mean, if you're willing to use willing to lose a 180 point unit, normally you'd be wanting to get some dark power out of that, and the Higher Deacon's ability to give them that buff Undying Demotion, it's a bit situational. You might not always get to use that. Cool models though. I like the fact that they look really good, and I love the look of the new centaurs, by the way, which are great. Let's now go to city-states. So city-states have been the worst faction in the game for a little while, and the two things that are now making them viable, thank goodness, are the newest releases, which are the Talos and the Chariots. So the Talos is something which actually gives this faction staying power. It actually is a really good scenario kind of play, and it is a good tar pit. It's a really good anvil for your other units to flank or to shoot. And because we now have viable shooting units in the form of these war chariots, especially the Scorpios, which are the better ones, that is something which works in their favor. So city-states are slowly sort of becoming this really sort of viable faction which can take on Old Dominion, take on Wardruna, and that sort of thing. But one thing I'm skeptical of, and I don't want to see, city-states become this faction where they're only competitive because of a couple of units, and everybody's just skewing the competitive play to that, and everybody's forking out money for the pay-to-win, most powerful new stuff, and there's the power creep, and you've got to buy a Talos, you've got to buy like 4 chariots. I'd hate to see that. I would rather see them continue to buff the weaker stuff in the faction, the Haspis and the Thyrians and the Phalangites, stuff like that. They just need to continue getting better and better and better. For Phalangites in particular, probably one of the weakest regiments in the entire game. I'd love them to further buff their defensive ability, where you don't just have pike formation. Give them like flawless strikes, either as a permanent rule, or have that ability for the rest of the turn after they get charged, just so they have a bit more punch when they get attacked, and they can become that defensive piece, which makes them a bit more useful. I'd love to see that kind of thing. Don't leave them as is. They're absolutely terrible at the moment. I did hear, though, that chariots are in for a bit of a balance pass. I think that the Scorpion and the Flogabololon is going to get a rework, where the Scorpios will come down a bit, the Flogabolon comes up a little bit, but they do need to get that right. They've also got some more stuff coming out, like the Sacred Band and all of that, so they are a work in progress, so I won't say much more about them now. Speaking of work in progress, though, if we go to Sorcerer Kings, this is the faction that I probably shouldn't say too much about, because they're just constantly getting looked at, and they're the faction that Parabellum are working on the most at the moment. But just a few points. I feel like Jadu Kovak is kind of a badly designed ability at the moment, because it's 30 points for something which is universal and an absolute no-brainer. You cast it, you get reroll 6s on all of your elementals. This does lead to the possibility of a skew list, where all you put in your list is just the Efreet Flamecasters. So you've got these guys that are Barrage 5 and Volley 2, Range 14, which is great, and Torrential Fire. So they are appropriately costed with those stats, but if they're getting reroll 6s every turn, and if you've got like 5 regiments throughout the battlefield, and they're always getting the rerolls of the 6, and then you're getting the rituals going up, giving them a free action, it's just too much of a skew list, and it's just going to too easily beat factions that are unprepared, and maybe a close game against factions that sort of know how to deal with that and have the tools. But really, you want it to be less of a no-brainer ability. I would definitely change it to First of all, make the upgrade a little bit cheaper, but restrict the sphere of influence. So make it all regiments within 12 of the character stand, or just that character stand's warband only can get the reroll sixes. Otherwise, it becomes just this kind of strategy you have to crutch on if you want to be competitive with Sorcerer Kings, where you're like, okay, I need to take only elementals which are air or fire and make them all benefit from the rerolls. So Maharaja with lots of flame classes is one way to do it. You can take the air school, for example, the court of air, and take lots of Trinivata, or a Mahout that has a Maharaja riding it, which then makes it court of air, and he gets the shots as well. So yeah, Sorcerer King's a bit of a gunline at the moment, but I don't want to suggest lots of changes to this faction because I know that they're in the process of making them and releasing new units. So I do trust Parabellum to sort that out. I will briefly mention too that the Windborn Elemental is probably the next thing in line for a buff at 190 points. On paper, it looks quite good with AP 1, Barrage 3, Range 20. That's kind of nice, but these guys are nothing compared to a unit like the Caryatids, for example. They're very, very expensive, and they just don't quite get the value out of it, and they're obviously terrible in close combat. We have the Raj and the Sorcerer, who are now sort of taking second place against the Maharaja after the in terms of being the Warlord, that is. After the rituals got changed, his supremacy ability just is a no-brainer value every time he activates, whereas these guys, sometimes their supremacy abilities don't really come in handy, I should say, especially not this guy's one. Terrifying, just not particularly useful, especially with Old Dominion being around. And then I'll also say that the Sardar is... I mean, I think I saw somebody mention that he's more for like First Blood or something like that. I mean, I think this guy should be a character that you should consider some of the time. Like, he should be the kind of character that provides something which is comparable to what you get from the other Sorcerer Kings characters. I think that, again, fixing duels and challenges would make him more useful again. And that's why I started this video with a commentary about why changing the nature of duels is important. It just affects so many different aspects of this game. This guy, I think if his stat line was improved, a bit like Clash 3, maybe attacks 5, Resolve 4, that'd be a big one. These are things which would make him more useful for leading a unit of Rajakor. He is very cheap, but he just does barely anything for that cost. I know he's got some good abilities, but when we compare him to the awesome stuff that the other characters do, I don't really see a lot of pull for him. So I hope they're going to be looking at him and improving his offering a little bit. Woof, long video, guys, hour and 10 minutes. Hope you guys stuck with me through that. As I said at the start of this video, Conquest isn't a great place. It's a really good competitive game, great game for tournaments, great game for competitive play. Really recommend trying it out. And for all of these little problems I've identified, there are so many things in the game that do work very well, that are exciting, and it's fun to build lists. But this game, not perfect. It could be in a better place. I'd love to see improvements, and I know that Parabellum are looking at improvements. I doubt they'll do everything that I've suggested in my video or address every problem that I've raised, but so long as they're continually, like every 4 or 5 months, bringing about some positive changes, then I'll be happy. And in the past, they have addressed things. For example, we had the meta of like Tauntors triple activating, that kind of thing. We've had the that fix. We've had the Ashen Dawn reduced in cost. That was the correct thing to do. So I'm glad that they're moving in the right direction. I personally, as a competitive player, would love to see that happen faster. But hats off to them for making a really good game. And thank you very much for watching and listening to my thoughts.